All right, my friends, chapter 12, we're back again. The key thing regarding this chapter is slavery is the crucial element that's going to divide the country in half. It will lead to major conflict. It is the key underlying issue. The key number, remember, is $4 billion in 1860 dollars that are invested in the slaves of the South, and that they cannot give those slaves up as easily as they would like and create free labor systems of market economies. So, one of the great tragedies of this time period is the Nat Turner Rebellion. And the Nat Turner Revolt is one of those horrible stories where violence, of course, is going to be a key element to it. But what every slave revolt leads to in terms of a result is harsher conditions for slaves. And the harsher conditions are kind of exemplified by the South and also how the South operates and how that works. So the reason, of course, the key reason to keep all this going is the fact that cotton is the key cash crop. And because there's no diversity in the Deep South, cotton is going to drive the economy. It's also going to drive the concept of rules. And that's why the big debate comes in. And the key thing about the rules that keeps getting the attention of the people of this time period is how those rules shape up in Congress. And the rules in Congress, remember, were somehow equalized by the 3/5 clause and the 1808 ban on slavery. But my conclusion is that this creates the unique system of racial treatment and racial segregation and racial, animosity that the United States is known for. Unique, I guess the best way to put it is version of racial relations. If you go to Brazil, you go to any other country, Jamaica, they do not have the history that we have regarding black and white. The reason, of course, is that by not allowing importation of slaves, we really were concerned about how to maintain and hold on to and control the slave. And that control is going to be where the insidiousness of this system is going to kind of really show up. If you think about society in the South, think about it divided up into a pyramid of sorts. Oh, that's a horrible line. Let's fix that. Yeah, a type of a pyramid where at the top of the pyramid, I don't know why I keep doing that. At the top of the pyramid, nice. Do that? No. Come on, work with me. At the top of the pyramid, you have the planters. Oh, that's the most horrible pyramid I've ever drawn in my entire life. Let's try that all over again. See if we can do that correctly. 1, 2. I can't draw straight lines. I don't know what the heck's wrong with me today. I don't know what the heck's wrong with my hand today. But guess what's on the top of the pyramid? Yeah, you guessed it. The planters are on the top of the pyramid. Guess what's on the bottom of the pyramid? The slaves are on the bottom of the pyramid. And society is going to be set up in this way, in this shape, in this form. And this shape and form is going to dictate how people treat each other in the South, but also how relationships are going to be formed in the South and how that's going to look. Oh, good God. What's happening to me? This is not even fun. I might need to redo the whole thing just because my pyramid won't show up the way I'd like it to. Yeah, watch me struggle with my pyramids. Yeah, fine, we got it more or less there. Oh, good Lord. Yeah, that's the bottom of the pyramid. Anyway, way at the top of this pyramid, where's my cursor? Where's my cursor? Come on back. Where are you? There we go. At the very top of the pyramid, the 1% that own more than 100 or more slaves are very rare. And as it gets divided up into groups, each group is benefiting from the labor at the bottom, which in this case is unfree labor of slaves. For the group at the bottom to allow slavery to end, it would mean a direct competition that they'd have to endure. For the group at the top, it would take away all their earning income, all of the money that they're making. And that system, unfortunately, is shaping itself up for a conflict, even within the Southern society. So to say that not every group benefited from slavery is an absolute lie. The other thing that you need to realize is that slavery as a system, it benefits everybody above it because it keeps the costs low. Because the number one rule of business in this time period and now is if you can keep your costs low, then you're going to make a profit. The key cost even today is labor costs. So they were looking for a way to keep those out and to keep a monopoly. Luckily, we did have a monopoly at the time period. The monopoly was on cotton, and British and New England factories loved cotton to make these new fabrics that were being pumped out by the bushel into the consumer's hands. And now it's become cheap enough to make. Well, the reason it's become cheap enough to make is that the cotton is now plentiful enough to make it all work. And that's kind of the idea behind that and where that goes. All right. So one of the arguments about slavery is often looked upon is how did they justify having slaves in this time period? Well, one of the key arguments is going to be eugenics, that there is a racial superiority here, a white supremacy that is coming out of Western Europe and the Americas. Superior. No. Let's not do that. Superior. This racial superiority is being derived from several sources, but in this case, it's a scientific reason that it looks like the lighter-skinned peoples of the earth are ruling, and then the darker-skinned peoples are doing all the work, and that tends to play itself out, and that becomes the rationale for it. Others pushed other concepts at the idea as well. Some other concepts that are kind of interesting or unique is the religious arguments. And there's religious arguments both ways. The religious arguments are going to be racial. They're also going to be slave-based. But there's also abolition arguments that come right out of the same scripture, in some cases the same verses, that are going to be used to push and make a rationale for holding on to slaves and keeping them under bondage, for what that kind of works with. A lot of people are looking at the abolition movement as an upheaval, which will lead to other problems such as women having the right to vote, classes being equalized, races being integrated. And that's, of course, a big fear of a lot of people who are in a position of power at that time in history. And that's where it's coming from. All right. So one of the key things about the South also, in terms of its culture and society, is that there's a culture of violence in the South that goes to the root of living in the frontier. The original settlers, as you remember, were mostly male. They were mostly individualists. And this individualism that's coming out of this time period is pushing a lot of people to rely on certain codes of conduct that we don't really see anymore in American culture. So, for instance, codes of honor, almost like what you would consider to be codes of chivalry, lead us into the interesting world of dueling, which, as you notice, Andrew Hamilton, Aaron Burr, Andrew Jackson, dueling is an interesting way of kind of defending oneself against the attacks of others. Southerners also have this concept that education is not necessary to be successful. And most education in the South is military or agricultural based. And this concept of formal education is not what the Southerner is pushing. And one of the major reasons is you don't use it when you're dealing with plantation agriculture or with agriculture in general. And that's the idea behind having that as well. Most of the slaves that are working, most of the slaves are divided into two categories. One is the house slave, the servants, then the field slaves. What you'll find is where we start to get the really undercurrent of negativity, where you start to see how sexual relations between black and white are totally different here than perhaps in other countries, where slavery existed. They were taboo, they were not talked about, but they were real. For instance, the famous, Jefferson Sally Heming family that was created because Jefferson, um, his DNA was in the slave population of his plantation, and Sally Heming was his mistress, who had children via his her master, I suppose is the best way to describe it. This often divided the slaves by skin color, ironically, which is not too ironic when you really think about where that skin color is coming from, into the house versus the field. And for the mistress of the house, or the woman of the house, it was often a known fact, but not really talked about, that the people working within her house were probably relatives of her husband, or her male relatives of the family, which put a lot of controversy into the owning of slaves, but also how slaves were manipulated and how slaves were used and often cast aside when they weren't seen as being of value or of production. It was pretty rare for slaves to have decent conditions. And the other question about slavery is, how effective is the labor when people are being worked so hard that there's no incentive to really produce? Well, they had to manipulate those slaves and create systems of control with violence and also with psychological warfare. And violence was the key conduit to which a lot of those relationships were kind of like ironed out and handed down. As a result, we had to completely destroy the African culture that was in the slave when they arrived. And the result of that was it was being replaced by a European hybrid. And the reason it was a European hybrid was they weren't allowed to integrate into places like the church, the language, and others. But the European hybrid was a crutch of sorts, which allowed slaves to exist, but controlled their existence quite dramatically. The rules about singing, dancing, drumming, speaking the local language, all of these are going to be severely regulated. And the only key area that is going to be allowed, or will be allowed to be within the control of the slave, is the relationship to Western religion. And Western religious philosophies and theologies are going to spring off into an African American existence. One of the results is a language that will be difficult to understand in the modern sense, but pidgin language, or pidgin English, pidgin, P-D-G-I-N, no O, sorry about that, pidgin. Pidgin English is going to be a dialect of the South, of the Southern slave. Usually the difficulty, of course, was in the translation of how the verbs are used. But it was a way of communicating, but it was also indicative of a lower class / lower function that was often taken for granted within the slave population, that made them look and appear to be less capable than what they really were. Religion. There you go. Got that one there too. One of the only other areas, I suppose, where religion plays a big role is in the slave spiritual. The spiritual is religious songs, but the spiritual often relied on rhythm of the hands, and also a very complex composition form, and a huge reliance on a lot of slave stories that were used as ways to motivate and perhaps enhance the morale of the slaves, who were always underneath the control of somebody else. The key item, the key remembrance of this chapter has to be the fact that the true cause of the split between the North and the South, the true split of those two areas, the key, crucial, overarching thing of all of it is slavery. If you have no slavery, you have no split. It's that simple. There would be no civil war. There would be no division. There would be no need to count more people for representation, because the reality is that you wouldn't need to do it if you didn't have to import African slaves. And the problem of being an African slave at this time is that your technology and your culture was behind the Western culture, so you're easily captured and easily moved and easily put into that position. Remember the fact that in the Middle Passage, estimates were millions of slaves moved from Africa to the United States and to the Americas in what was called the Triangle Trade. And of those that made it to the United States, only about 5% made it into the colonies, which eventually become the United States. And of those millions that came, 12 million made it into the U.S. Made the initial journey. 12 million were loaded onto ships in Africa, and only 8 million arrived. And of those 8 million that arrived, the significance is that you lost 25% on the journey. And that was a horrible trip. It also indicated how poorly they were treated, and also shows you how desperate we were to import them to keep that labor supply going for those cash crops. So the sad truth is that slavery is the cause of it all. And without it, I don't think you have the serious problems that you have in the 1800s that are emerging at this time in history. And neither do you have the big fights brewing in the background every time you add a new territory to either the West or the North, or the South for that matter. So that's the end of chapter 12. Hope it was good for you. We'll talk to you soon.